1664, and this guy, Robert Hooke, is messing about with his latest acquisition. One of these. Yep, that is indeed a microscope. Now, it was actually a pretty new invention back in the mid-17th century, because the first records that we have of working microscopes date back to the early 1590s, and well, they seem to be credited to the father and son duo of Hans and Zacharias Janssen from Middelburg in Holland. Incidentally, same two guys who at least attempted to take the credit for inventing the telescope. Now, this design was improved on by Galileo Galilei in 1609, and yet again by Robert Hooke. Now, the next big leap in microscope design came in the 1670s, courtesy of the Dutch scientist Antoine de Leeuwenhoek, who designed a high-powered single-lens microscope which allowed him to see details previous devices hadn't. But that's another story. Getting back to Robert Hooke, though, turns out, as we know, that Hooke was a very keen artist, which went all the way back to his childhood in the Isle of Wight. Sickly child, not much else to do, so he drew a lot. And when he looked down his microscope, quite obviously, he drew what he saw. Eventually, in 1665, he published this book, Micrographia. Some of his observations during the writing and his fascination with fossils started him down the path of being one of the forefathers of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Because looking at the fossils, looking at the modern animals, looking at the modern equivalents, he realised that there was a through line. Things were changing over time. Alright, he didn't explain or try to explain how it happened, but he'd realised that it was happening. And here is the picture that kicked off an entire branch of science, cellular biology. This drawing is of a section through a piece of cork. Now, he called those little spaces cells, because when he looked at them, he thought they looked like the cells monks slept in a monastery. Right, so that's the history out of the way. So let's get into some science. There are two basic types of cell. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking animal and plant, aren't you? Yeah? Sorry, not quite. The two types are prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Heard those words before? You're about to hear them quite a lot. Prokaryotes haven't got a true nucleus. Okay, their nuclear material is usually concentrated in kind of one specific area in the cytoplasm, but there's no membrane separating it from the rest of it. Most prokaryotes on this planet are bacteria. And here's what one of them looks like. Well, sort of. It's a diagram. But it gives you the idea. It's also worth remembering that these things are a lot smaller than eukaryotic cells, such as animal, plant or fungal cells. Now, in terms of what goes on in there, the cell wall, which is made from an incredibly tough substance called peptidoglycan, acts as sort of a scaffold for the rest of the cell. All the other structures are attached to it via something called the cytoskeleton, which is part of the cytoplasm. Now, in bacteria, the cell wall can offer a level of protection. Some bacteria even absorb metal ions into the structure of their cell walls to make them stronger still. So, basically, guys, bacteria are metal. Now, sat on the outside of that cell wall, on a lot of bacteria, is something called a capsule, sometimes also known as a slime layer. Now, it's mostly made up of long-chain sugars called polysaccharides. Poly meaning many, saccharide, well, sugar. This capsule is a protective layer, because, for one thing, it's hard for an animal or plant immune system to attack. because what they would need is a very specific antibody to just that particular slime layer. So you can't use it against a whole raft of them, which is quite clever on the old evolution front. And it can also stop the bacteria from dehydrating because it contains water. Now, if we go inside the cell wall, there's a structure there called the cell membrane. 2 layers of lipids. Its function is to control what substances enter and leave the cell. Right? That's it. Controls what enters and leaves the cell. And that applies to all cell membranes. It doesn't protect the cell or anything like that. It just controls what goes in and out. Right? That is important. Once you pass the cell membrane though, you're into the cytoplasm. And generally, like in just about every cell across the planet, this is where most of the chemical reactions take place. Anything the cell makes or processes gets dealt with in there. Now in terms of texture, think sort of wallpaper paste. Thick and very sticky. That way it keeps all the structures that sit inside it in place and gives the whole cell a bit of structure. Now, talking to things inside the cytoplasm, there's 2 main things in your prokaryotes: genetic material and ribosomes. Now, the genetic material comes in 2 forms. First, there's the chromosome, which is concentrated in one area of the cell that is called the nucleoid, but there's no actual nucleus. There's no membrane around it separating it from the rest of the cytoplasm. And that's why these things are called prokaryotes. We'll get into the full explanation of that later. Now the chromosomes, well, chromosome singular usually, contain all the information necessary to make the cell do what it needs to do, stored as genes, which are made of DNA. And each chromosome, of which there's usually only 1 in a bacteria, is one single, very long, coiled up, very tightly coiled up, single loop. Now, it's not the only loop of DNA that you'll find inside a bacterial cell. There are also these things called plasmids, also known as jumping genes. These are small circles of DNA, usually coding for maybe 1 or 2 genes, and they carry extra characteristics such as, for example, antibiotic resistance, or possibly along with that a characteristic which allows them to make the bacterial cell produce what's called a pilus, which allows it to cross over into another bacterium. And the plasmids are self-replicating, so they can spread from one bacterium to another very easily, either by leaving the cell and going to the next one, or, like I said, using the pili. Now you'll find more about the benefits and dangers of plasmids later on in the course when we get into genetic engineering. Finally, inside your bacteria, you've got ribosomes. Simply enough, they make proteins using plans that are stored in the DNA on the genes. Simple, that, wasn't it? Right, time to take the complexity up a notch. We'll have a look at eukaryotes, because eukaryotes do have a nucleus. In fact, that's why they're called eukaryotes. Karyote is derived from the ancient Greek for nut or kernel. Not military kernel, but kernel as in seed. Something else that separates eukaryotes from the prokaryotes is that they have definite organelles surrounded by membranes. Now, taking this in alphabetical order, because why not? We'll start by looking at a generalised animal cell. Now this one is pretty much identical to the sort of cells you'll find sort of in the top layers of your skin. Epithelial cells, they call them. And as you can see from this diagram, it's got 5 main bits. First, you've got the cell membrane. Then there's the cytoplasm, ribosomes, mitochondria, and the nucleus. So just running down the function, shall we? Now, just like the prokaryotes, the cell membrane, notice there's no cell wall on this one, controls what enters and leaves the cell. That's all it does. No protection. I mean, you could probably argue that it holds the cytoplasm in, but that's kind of reaching a little bit. Now, talking the cytoplasm, again, it's just like with a prokaryote. That's where the majority of the chemical reactions happen inside the cell. Texture-wise, same as the prokaryotes. Thick and sticky like wallpaper. Embedded in there is the cytoskeleton. And that supports the nucleus, the ribosomes, the mitochondria, as well as anything else that might be in there. Stops them all bumping into each other and falling out the bottom of the cell. Now, the mitochondria. Simply put, these are the powerhouse of the cell. All the reactions involved in respiration, turning all that lovely glucose and oxygen into energy, carbon dioxide and water to keep the cell functioning, happen right inside those things. With the ribosomes, they do the same thing as in the prokaryotes. They make proteins. Now, considering most of your body runs because of proteins, controlling reactions or speeding them up, slowing them down, like the surface of your eye is made of protein, most of your skin is made up of protein, you've got metalloproteins in your blood, hemoglobin, all over the place. Tells you that ribosomes do an incredibly important job. Now, the only real difference, interestingly, between prokaryotic ribosomes and eukaryotic ribosomes is that the eukaryotic ones are slightly bigger. And in eukaryotes, they can only work one at once. Other than that, they're pretty much identical, which kind of suggests a common ancestor, a common origin, which again is kind of sort of compelling evidence for evolution. Interesting, that, isn't it? And it's not the only thing in the cell that has compelling evidence for evolution wrapped up inside it, as you'll find out if and when you go to A level. And I might mention it again when we get onto the genetic stuff. So, now, last but definitely not least in this case is the nucleus. This is important. This is vitally important towards you getting marks and understanding how all this stuff works. Before you even think it, no, the nucleus is not and never has been the brain of the cell. Whoever told you that, you are right now entitled to go up to them, point straight at their faces, laugh derisively and say, you were wrong. It's not the brain of the cell. Ha! I'll wait while you go do it. Okay, right, the nucleus is where the genetic material, or, well, DNA in the case of eukaryotes, but it could be bits of RNA as well, we'll get onto that later, is stored in a very, very, very tightly coiled structure called a chromosome, and eukaryotes tend to have multiple copies of those. For example, our species, humans, 23 pairs, so 46 chromosomes altogether. All tightly. I mean, each one of the cells in your body contains about a meter's length, possibly up to 2 meters of DNA. And it's all coiled up into a microscopic object, and you're built up of millions of those. Amazing, that, isn't it? Right, let's take a look at plant cells then. Now, as you can see, they have got everything that animal cells have, with, to be fair, all the same functions. But there are a few other organelles as well. Starting out with the cell wall. Now, in a plant cell, it's made of cellulose, but it does not protect the cell. Get that idea right out of your head right now, because you'll write it down in an exam, or you'll say it to somebody else and you'll be wrong. It's kind of more like scaffolding on a building. It helps the cell to keep its shape, along with the vacuole, we'll get onto that, and helps the entire plant stand up, because you've got like this frame on top of another frame, on top of another frame, on top of another frame, and frames all around the side of it. You've got a massive framework there, haven't you? That's what it is. Now, talking of the vacuole, it's that big thing in the middle of the cell, which is full of water and starch and acts as a food store. And the pressure pushing outwards from the vacuole and the pressure pushing inwards from the cell wall balances to make the cell itself pretty much rigid, as well as being a food store. What it's got in there, mixing with the water, is starch. Why starch? Well, if you try putting glucose in there, it would just diffuse straight across that semi-permeable membrane and vanish out of the cell. So what you got to do is, if you're a plant, make it into a bigger molecule that will not diffuse out of the membrane. So, starch. Animals do it as well, except they use glycogen. Now that glucose is made in, if you look, those green things, the chloroplasts. Now chloroplasts are green because of a green pigment called chlorophyll, which can absorb energy from sunlight, and it can be used then to power the photosynthesis chemical reactions. Yeah? Kind of like a battery. Photosynthesis is, well, as we all know, the process plants use to make glucose to feed themselves. Now then, there's one last type of eukaryote to have a look at. The fungal cell. And for this one we will be a bit more specific and we'll say the yeast form. We won't look at the mycelia, we'll just look at the yeast. Now as you can see from this diagram, it's kind of halfway between animal and plant in terms of structures. Now the similarities, it shares cell membranes, it shares cytoplasm, it shares mitochondria with all the other types of cell. It also shares a cell wall with the plants and the bacteria, the prokaryotes, except in a fungal cell, that cell wall is made of chitin, which is the same stuff that insect exoskeletons are made of. So again, we're kind of edging nearer to it being an animal. Good, that, isn't it? There's also a vacuole in there, like with the plant cell. And if we're being absolutely right and accurate about it, animal cells do have vacuoles. The only difference is they are a lot smaller and they are temporary structures. They don't stick around very long. But one thing you will notice about your fungal cell, no chloroplasts, because that's not how a fungus feeds. Funguses feed by absorbing dissolved food materials across their cell membranes, kind of like we do. Right, summing up then, what have we learned? Number one, all types of cell have got certain components in common, such as cytoplasm, cell membrane, so on. Number two, the only type of cell that doesn't have a cell wall is an animal cell. No animal cells have cell walls. Not a single one of them. Ever. Right? Never. Number three, cell walls can be made of multiple different substances, such as peptidoglycan in bacteria, cellulose in plants, or chitin in fungi. Number four, all cells contain genetic material, either in a nucleus or in an area inside itself that's been nicknamed the nucleoid. Right? Okay. Now, remember, share this with your friends if they are also struggling with the cell biology stuff. And if you have a look in the comments section below, you will find that there are links to the Heavy Metal Science Teacher Facebook and Twitter pages. I'm also going to be putting together some resources that will go with this video. So keep your eyes peeled, keep watching the comments, and I'll see you next time.